all this funding that goes into cyber companies, yet we still hear of breaches. Like, what's going on? The types of applications that I was building, mostly it's cybersecurity hacking type of tools. I just found it fascinating to be able to make computers do what people didn't want them to do. The estimate for running Mythos on every single one of these is in the millions of dollars, like tens of millions in fact. And the agents are very easy to sway. A lot of effort has to go in to making sure they don't do what nefarious actors want them to do. We're basically saying, look, the model that wrote the code can't be the model that secures the code.
Zaid, thanks for being on the podcast. Really happy to talk to you today. I think we were talking about before recording. I'm a little biased of our conversation today. I want to start where we first met, and I feel embarrassed to say this story. It's like with Immunio, right?
Yeah.
Where we're both tenants of WeWork, and which I had completely forgotten until you reminded me on the stage. You're like, oh yeah, I used to. So maybe walk us through Immunio, the company, why you started it, and what it was.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. So I guess maybe just before Immunio, just to introduce a little bit myself and how I ended up there. So at a very young age, like many people in our industry, I fell in love with coding. So I remember at age 10 or 11, I was writing a lot of code. I would save money, buy programming books, spend hours programming every day. And I knew at a very young age that I was going to spend a career building software and businesses, to be honest. Now, the types of applications that I was building, the things that I actually found interesting to build, I did the occasional like video game here or there, but really it was mostly the cybersecurity hacking type of tools. I just found it fascinating to be able to make computers do what people didn't want them to do. And so that passion stayed with me. So I ended up originally from the Middle East, from Jordan, born and raised there. I ended up in Canada, studied at McGill, did a degree in engineering, worked as a computer software professional for a few years, maybe 10, 12 years, not in cybersecurity, but cyber was always the thing that I really enjoyed. That's what kept me in touch with tech. What I was always fascinated was always reading. And now how that ended up in Immunio, my last job before I turned entrepreneur was I was working for a company called Canonical. Canonical is very well known in open source land. It's the company behind the Ubuntu Linux distribution. And I was running product management there. And there was the Ubuntu free open source Linux distribution, but then the company had a number of commercial offerings to sell to companies like Google and Salesforce and IBM, usually in the form of tools to help you manage thousands of machines, right? The free stuff that you can download, but then once you have tens of thousands of them, you usually need something to be able to manage that fleet of machines. And so one of our commercial products was a product that did that. And we had built it. It was great. People loved it. It was selling. And part of what we needed to do was just make sure that product was secure, that you cannot make it do things it wasn't meant to do, because the whole point of this product is to manage thousands of machines. If it were accessed by a hacker or somehow somebody was able to subvert it, then you can imagine they'd be able to do like very nefarious things to those machines, because that's what the product is about. It's about managing large numbers of machines. And so we would do security testing on those products. And actually one of our star engineers at the company was finding flaws left and right internally before the product was ever released. And me and one of the engineers on my team were, okay, how do we actually, these are the bugs that they found, but we're not going to find everything. And we're shipping and we're doing CI/CD and DevOps and Agile, like we're releasing fast. Like before it was cool, as they say. And so how do we, add some level of security and protection? And, what we were using at the time was something called web application firewalls, kind of like network layer device that checks input. If it looks suspicious, it blocks it. That was the idea. And at the time, so 2012, 2011, that, it really was not very good tech. It was very cumbersome to manage, very difficult to deploy and configure and keep running. And it didn't really work very well. Like people were able to, quote unquote, evade these technologies relatively easily. So, me and that engineer, Mike, who became my co-founder at Immunio, had this idea. At the time, there was a company called New Relic that was quite popular and did really well. That had basically an instrumentation-based approach. So it was a different type of approach than just doing network layer stuff. Um, we wrote a prototype. It worked really well. It looked like it could tick all of those boxes, right? And we thought that, there's a whole industry of these applications that need to be protected. And we think we just built something much, much better than what was considered state of the art at the time, right? So that's, there was basically an interest in cyber and like always connected to that field. And then a real world problem that we faced while trying to secure a very critical application at a company. And that was basically the inception of Immunio. We pitched the idea to a number of VCs. It got funded pretty quickly, actually. Put together a company, and within maybe a couple of years, we had a few really good customers using our stuff. Companies like SurveyMonkey and Career Builder and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Was it hard to make the jump? Was it an easy decision? I'm going to leave the safe company to start something. You had never done that before, right?
Yeah, to be honest, I think I wouldn't say it was easy, but for me, it was always part of the path. Like, I knew since I was a teenager that one day I'm going to build my own software company, because I think that's very fascinating and very interesting. And a lot of the companies and entrepreneurs that I look up to, that's the path they chose. And I just knew I had it in me. I think the experience that I had leading up to that point gave me the confidence. I ran product management at a very successful company at a relatively young age. And we had seen all this traction, all this success. And I learned a lot along the way. Got to the point where I was confident that whatever I don't know, we're gonna figure it out. But I do think that's usually the hardest for most people. The difference, I think, between entrepreneurs and people that want to be, or really want to be entrepreneurs but just can't make the jump, is that fear factor. It is always safer to work in a stable job, not take risk, and so on and so forth. But I think some people are just there is nothing else. They know they have to do it. They have it in them.
Yeah, I could definitely relate to that a little bit. And maybe I'll share my perspective from Immunio.
Sure.
Because we're my old company, we're the first tenants that we work with you guys. And I was like, we kept seeing the Immunio t-shirts, right? Like the blue and your team kept growing. At one point, you guys were it felt like you were taking over all of
we had the
WeWork.
biggest suite, actually, at WeWork.
You're like, I don't know, 20, 30 people. This were like a small company, 4 or 5 people at the time. And it's funny because when I was saying you're embarrassed, I was embarrassed because like at our launch, you're like, you recalled that us being neighbors. I completely had forgotten. Like, this is even after we had invested in your company. I was like, I should have probably remembered that. So yeah, it was great because I remember my thinking of Immunio back in time. This company's on fire. It's like you kept hiring people.
Yeah, so we had basically the story of Immunio was, so we had this innovation or this idea of how to do something better, and we had built it, and we'd proven it, and we actually got patents on it, and so on and so forth. And the year after, Gartner, the famed analyst firm, created a category and put us in it. So the category was called RASP, Runtime App Self-Protection. And there was, at the year one, there's only us and 2 other vendors, I think. And it gave the industry, or it gave the category, some form of legitimacy. We're not the only ones that are thinking about this problem. And customers would start to ask about it. And so we, especially after we got our first 2 or 3 major clients in the Bay Area, and they loved the tech. Like, the tech worked really well. It solved some real problems for people. We basically went on a hiring spree. We started growing the company. There was the inevitable ups. We originally started with a developer-based go-to-market. We offer it for free, let developers use it, self-serve, and then try to convert some of them. Back then in 2013, 2014, so a couple of years after we started, maybe the market was still not ready for that type of thing, especially in security. Security was still managed. Most enterprises, it was a separate function, and it was still far from developers. Like, Kubernetes wasn't even a thing at the time. DevOps was barely adopted. It was early days. Now, what happened was maybe 3 or 4 years later, by 2017 or 2016, I think a lot of the vendors, basically, the whole market was able to get a few marquee customers, but we didn't see hockey stick growth. And it was largely because there was friction in deployment. So we were selling a developer type of technology, but the benefit was when the technology was deployed to production. And today, it's much more acceptable. You've got Kubernetes automation. You can deploy something. DevOps engineers are everywhere. But back then, it was still early days for this whole transition. It became clear that this was going to be a very long slog of a market for everybody. And the reality is we decided that it made sense to, all right, it's going to take too long.
So you guys provoked the exit, the M&A path.
Well, yeah, there's a number of vet acquirers that have been talking to us for a while because they thought the technology itself was interesting. They needed something to help actually with the Kubernetes security. Because if you're the company that ended up acquiring us was a company called Trend Micro. I'll talk about it in a second. Great company. But these so you can think of them as like competitors to CrowdStrike and SentinelOne and so on and so forth. They sell product that goes on servers, on endpoints, and anything that's running inside of a Kubernetes cluster, for example, or they're invisible to. So they needed some technology to be able to monitor at the application level, which is exactly what RASP technologies were about. So in I think 2 or 3 years since we were acquired, so was every other RASP vendor, pretty much everybody, right? So essentially the category folded into a much larger category.
There's consolidation. And
correct.
So talk a little bit about the exit to Trend Micro. It was like 2018, 19?
It was 2020, end of 2017, 2018. Yeah. So like I said, we had been talking to them for quite some time. We'd built a relationship and so on and so forth. Great company. It was interesting to go from like a smaller. So prior to starting Immunio, like I said, I was running product management at an open source company that was about 1,000 employees, but operated very much like a startup. There's really decentralized thinking, moving fast, modern development practices. And so that was that, a small startup. And then within Trend Micro, which is, again, I think it was a great company, great culture. But what I learned quickly is that so most of these large companies, they have thousands of customers, okay? And it's a good thing. As companies grow, they'll have thousands of customers. The challenge, though, is that an inordinate amount of resources, budgets, people, will go to protecting that existing business, okay? So instead of the focus being innovation, next generation, solving tomorrow's problems, it's how do we make sure we renew that biggest customer, because a good chunk of our revenue comes from these. So there's always this tension between building and innovating and solving tomorrow's problems versus the business really needs these things to. And that leads to, and I guess this is why large companies have to acquire startups continuously, nonstop, now and in the future. This tension is, I think, both inevitable and healthy. As I realized the part that I'm definitely wired for is the innovation part. And so
the 0 to 1, as they
the
say,
0
right?
to 1, 1 to 10, this is where,
Yeah.
I think is the fun part for me. Yeah.
So after the exit, you spoke about this market insight you had. What was the market insight for Boost, right? After your exit?
It was actually essentially a lot of continuation from Immunio. Sometimes I tell people it's like the same mission. It's just the next set of problems. So the one way I like to talk about it is to say the path we were on, even from the old days of Immunio and RASP as a category and so on, was very much software development. It takes some effort to do a good job at software development. It takes more effort to make sure that software that's produced is safe, secure, hardened, not easy to hack. It takes practice, it takes effort, right? And technology expertise and so on. And the insight at Immunio was that, look, we'll never be able to do a perfect job before things go to production. So let's put something in production that gives extra armor. That was the core insight. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these were early days. It was really, because you didn't have Kubernetes, observability platforms, runtime instrumentation, like it became not very easy to actually get the thing deployed and people to see the benefit was hard work. But in 2019, 2020, the market had evolved. There's a lot more companies doing Agile and DevOps. DevSecOps was a practice. Kubernetes was like widespread, which basically allows for a lot of the automation, instrumentation. You can actually deploy things really quickly now. And so I had reached out to a lot of the people that I worked with in the industry, my old days, and told them, what have you tried to solve in DevSec? How well is it working for you? The whole concept of, can we secure software at the speed of developing it? And the answer was a resounding, everybody's trying, nobody's successful at it, unless you're like Google and Apple and Meta, the big tech companies that effectively build everything in-house. And so the insight was, that should be solved. It can be solved. We can actually bring in Google, Facebook, or Meta, Apple's sort of secure software development practices, deliver it as a service into every organization, deliver that as a SaaS. And that was the inception to the point. So the reason why I want to emphasize that is it's basically Immunio was, you'll never do a great job there. So let's add some protection at runtime, at production. But then now we said, well, the market changed, technology's changed, development practices changed. You can actually do a pretty decent job early on. It's just not easy. So let's make it easy. That was the inception. Now, funny enough, I'll tie that to where we are today. The way I talk about it is, so companies were doing some form of application security or the practices to make software development safe. That's like going from 1 to 10. Like you already do something, but you're trying to do it faster because now you're developing faster with new software development practices and so on. But what we're seeing now with agents and agents writing code and agentic engineering is, I would say it's the same thing. It's just much faster and it's happening in a different pace. So it's going from 10 to 100, but it's fundamentally the same problem, which is code is being generated at a faster and faster rate. It's more complex code. How do I not slow down innovation, but yet ensure that we are producing software that's not going to lead to headline news, customer breaches, lawsuits, bad reputation damage, and so on.
Yeah, there's so many different areas we could lead this, right? So going back to why I'm excited with what you're doing at Boost. But I want to talk about maybe cybersec as a whole,
Sure.
because of where you're talking about this big change that's happening. And we were talking about before about like how Mythos is like, I think the best thing to happen to cybersecurity in a while, where it's top of mind for every CISO,
Yep.
right? So the attack surface for hackers, right? Because in your company, you're protecting essentially against attacks. I know the answer to this question, but to hear you, how is this new vibe coding, this new way of building software, how has it increased that surface plane for attackers?
Oh, yeah. I think in many ways, I'm going to give some specific examples, but I once had to give a talk to an audience, none of which was in the cyber industry. And I needed to explain like why somebody asked the question, all this funding that goes into cyber companies, yet we still hear of breaches. What's going on? And I think the general pattern is this: technology and innovation never stops. So there's always some new standard, some new technology that catches wildfire and becomes adopted like crazy. So whether it was email, the internet, mobile apps, was it more a thing one day where everybody wanted a mobile app strategy, cloud computing, and all the way down to agents writing code now, right? These technologies get adopted at a crazy fast rate when it's the right format, right price, right time, all that stuff. Security research happens at a much slower rate. Okay. Research, at least until now, needs these experts to spend hours and weeks and months and years trying to understand how that technology can be abused. So basically, since the dawn of tech, technologies get adopted super fast, much faster than the ability to find flaws in them. And so what ends up happening, you find yourself in that scenario time and again, which is we've got tens of millions of things that have already been deployed where we're just starting to find out how hackers can breach them. Okay. And so the industry was always like this. We discover that everybody's got mobile phones, but we didn't think of mobile phone security. And so hackers start hacking because it's easy. And then a mobile security industry emerges to plug the holes in that industry. And that happened for cloud computing, containers, Kubernetes, and we can go on and on. I think so. Now we're at the age where agents and vibe coding is the thing. It caught wildfire. Okay. Faster than an industry. Nobody stopped and said, let's make sure we build this security first. That never happened. It's just, it got deployed, pushed, everybody's using it. And now every week, researchers come up with new ways in which, we can subvert your coding agent. And if you download this agent skill that's kind of malicious, bad things can happen. Oh, and by the way, you're connecting this MCP server that does that. And so I guess my point is, there's nothing special just because it's vibe coding. It's just the natural way of how technology gets adopted and how security research happens. And it will always be this case. Now, I would say that things that are specific, I think, to agentic coding, the rate at which it's pulled is crazy. right?
So part of it is speed, right? Where it's like
Speed.
the agent's going to go in the GitHub repo, pull up. It's not going to check the repository. There's a bunch of malicious code in there.
Yeah,
So
they
that
can be subvert. Agents are very easy to sway. Okay. A lot of effort has to go into making sure they don't do what nefarious actors want them to do. And so whether they're pulling an open source package that has bad instructions for the agent, whether they're 2 days ago, GitHub was breached. The company we all rely on for software development, they themselves were breached. An engineer working for GitHub downloaded an extension for his IDE, VS Code, and there was malware in it, supply chain attack. We'll talk about that, and led to a breach of internal source code repos, right? So it will happen to the best of us, right? It doesn't mean that GitHub or any a company falling victim to this. It's just the reality is we use this tech at a rate and at a pace that we just didn't have time to pause and think of all the security implications. And the industry now is trying to catch up and say, all right, here's all the million and one ways bad things can happen. Subverting agents is one. That's one way. Supply chain attacks, I think, is a sleeper here. That's the one that
can you
us in the
explain
industry.
what it means? What is supply
Yes.
chain?
For the last, I don't know, 25, 30 years, open source has just been growing in popularity. And we have open source projects for everything. Your web front end frameworks, your APIs, security libraries, you name it, you're probably building on some form of open source. I've seen, and we've had examples where attackers figured out that, hey, people are just trusting that this open source project is used by people, but maybe we can find a way to inject some bad code in there, malicious code, and then wait for people, developers, to pull that code in. It used to be, we saw some examples of this in the last few years, but then in the last year and a half, it's become such a problem. Every month, hundreds, if not thousands of incidents of this are happening to everybody. And it could be the many variations of this, but it could be your developer tools that you use. It could be open source libraries that you use. It could be Chrome extensions that you're adding. There's many flavors of that. But that is a supply chain attack. It's you're introducing something into your supply chain or into your how you build software that has backdoors and malware and sort of malicious code in it.
And it goes back to agents finding,
So
basically.
it could be
So
agents, it could be humans too. It's not unique to agents, but agents have the same failure modes as do humans. They will download open source tools. They will install stuff without really thinking about, is it safe to install or not? They can fall victim to these types of supply chain attacks. And I'd say what happened was where it really started to, so we've been researching this area for many years. I'll talk about some of our research there, but there's a particular actor called Team PCP that kind of specialized in these types of supply chain attacks, and they've really been causing a lot of damage since March of this year. They've done some attacks from before then, but since March, they've been nonstop, major breach after major breach, using these types of techniques. And typically what happens in a supply chain attack, let's say the common case is Nectar wants to vibe code this new application for Amiral Ventures. And so he whips up Claude Code and starts writing code. And Claude at some point will go and download some open source library to do its job. But that library is compromised. It got compromised last week by Team PCP or some attacker like that, where they inserted some malicious code. Now, what Claude does is it'll install that package. The malware may look at, hey, what kind of keys are configured on this machine? And maybe it finds your GitHub credentials. And so now it goes to Nectar's GitHub repos and it inserts code to propagate to other. So now all of a sudden, other people working with Nectar on that project, the next time they try to build a project, they get infected and so on and so forth. So we're seeing these spreading like wildfire type of attacks. Tens of thousands, maybe more GitHub credentials have already been exposed. The public, like the damage that's public that we know of, include things like Cisco, for example, lost proprietary code bases, hundreds of them. In fact, including some of their latest AI products. There's big class action lawsuits. I mentioned GitHub a few minutes ago. It's like a company we all trust to do good work for us. Yeah, so this is one example. There's many more, but in a nutshell, it's a very dangerous.
Explain maybe what is developer endpoint security, right? Like how does the developer fit in all of this?
Since the attackers have started targeting these developers or developer infrastructure. So these types of supply chain attacks typically are targeting developers. And typically what they're trying to do, so when we said developers use open source packages, attackers poison these open source packages. There's many ways they can do that. And then they're waiting for developers to download and install them. It turns out that you really can't just wait to once the application is in production or once I check in the source code into GitHub to scan it there, because the damage is already happening on your laptop the second you install that package, for example, or that IDE extension or whatnot. Now, the damage is also done there. It's not just that you install it, but that's where you lost your GitHub access or GitHub tokens or access to some cloud API of sorts, right? It's on your developer machine. Developer machines typically tend to be more special than, let's say, a machine in an enterprise marketing department, because typically we give developers ability to install and uninstall software. We don't really block their network access as much because their job requires that they download stuff, install stuff, test stuff, and so on. And because they generally have more privilege, like they have access to push to Kubernetes, they have access to log into Datadog. And so they'll have API keys on their machines, not always stored in the safest format. So this is why they're such valuable targets for hackers. So because of this, we recognize that it's a developer machine is not just like any other machine. It's not Jane for marketing. So it needs its own, because of the unique risks, we want to be able to protect it. You have to take those unique risks into account. And so we developed this technology, developer endpoint security, which is really about, let's assume breach first, assume that that developer will at some point or another fall victim to some supply chain attack of this sort. What can you do beforehand to limit the damage, limit the blast radius? And what can you do after to make sure that you do the right things if an incident were to happen to make sure that the damage is contained, right? Yeah. Typically it's key rotation as well.
So maybe it's a good talking point to talk about your particular innovation with Boost, right? Because it's not just one thing, you do multiple interesting products.
Yeah.
So with everything that's going on in this world, like how do you protect against these attacks, right? And my sense is that you guys are also at the cutting edge of this space right now, right? It's also not common for a startup of your size to have a research team and with François that's focused on this. So yeah, I know it's a broad question, but how does Boost help their customers to avoid getting hacked in this?
Yeah. So first of all, we're very proud of the customers that we have. We've got some really great customers, some of the largest companies in the US, some of the biggest software companies in the world trust us to help them build secure software and build software securely. Now, we have always had a research team. So Francois, our VP of Security Research, was actually one of the first engineers to join the company. And actually, he was the first engineer to join the company. And we've had he's been holding a research function since then. We've had a research team since day one. There were two major incidents. So the company was founded in 2020, but we really got funded and started in 2020, end of 2021, beginning of 2022. Two things happened in 2020. There were two major events. One was both related to supply chain. So one was Log4j. There's this very common package that everybody used that had this crazy vulnerability that hackers can exploit with push button ease, right? And so the whole industry tried to find, where are we using this? We got to fix it. It was, if you don't fix it quickly, assume hacked, right? And that was one. And the second thing was there was a very famous supply chain incident affecting a company called SolarWinds in the US. Now, both of these were like Richter scale 9 type of events. The whole industry kind of woke up. And we focused our research on supply chain industry as early as then. And we're very proud of the work that the team has done. So we've produced the world's first attack models, actually modeling out the theory how attackers can actually hack developer infrastructure. We've released a number of open source tools that we've actually learned that some of the biggest security companies in the world use internally to test their stuff, and some of the biggest consulting shops. We even found out that Google actually uses it in-house. Incidentally, all these tools have a Montreal food name theme. So one's called Poutine, one's called Bagel, one's called Smoked Meat. That's the 3 open source tools that we were very proud of. And so, yeah, we just believe in security research. I think also good security companies have that function. This is where I always say research informs product decision, right? We're kind of sitting at the forefront of what is possible. How do hackers think? What can they do? And then you work your way backwards from there. How can you secure? How can you protect? And so on and so forth. Now, this is the origin of how that came to be. Now, how do we actually end up helping customers is multiple ways. So again, the mission didn't change. It's more about like we want to help companies build software securely and build secure software. 5 years ago, that was DevOps and DevSecOps and shifting left. And basically just developers are shipping code 30 times a day. Can we scan 30 times a day and tell the developers what to fix, what's worth fixing, and so on and so forth? Now we've got agents writing code, and then we've got all these attackers coming in through open source land. And these are the two biggest risks. So our technologies, our products really try to address these two areas. We went into the developer machine because that's where Claude is working. That's where where the agents are generating code. So you have to be like right there before the code is even written. You have to be telling Claude how to write code securely. Before Claude decides to bring in a library or a package, you have to tell Claude, let me first check if this is safe to bring and use, or if there's known malware or any weird signals, or if it's something better to use. Once code gets written, there's a whole slew of checks that you got to do. And then, of course, we want to look at the machine and say, okay, why is this developer leaving these 30 credentials open? If they were to fall victim to a supply chain attack, the damage would be big. Let's tell the developer how to fix and improve the machine posture, and so on and so forth. Now, once code gets generated and gets pushed to your usual CI/CD pipeline, we have the same type of engine, the same agents working with cutting-edge scanning technology, some of which we built, some of which we acquired, to try to give the same level of comfort and guarantees to the organization, right? So where the code gets generated, whether it's human written or agent written, doesn't matter. At the point of inception all the way through to production, we're there.
How do you think about the classic investor question of TAM, right? Because like you mentioned, some of the biggest software companies in the world are using your product today. But as software trends to zero, and every company becomes like software, there are many more, at least, software companies. Is that the time? Every company in the world is over time? Or do you think about it more niche? It has to be enterprise, bigger, like multiple devs?
No, I think so for sure, the market today is very much enterprise. The companies that actually spend serious amounts of money on producing secure software typically tends to be large enterprises. There are historical reasons for that. Usually it's like regulatory. If you're a financial services company, you're expected to comply with certain regulations that basically say you can't just whip out software, throw it over the fence if it handles client financial information. You have to show that you're doing work to make sure that software cannot be breached easily, right? Same thing for healthcare and so on and so forth. So it typically tends to be enterprise. Of course, how the world evolves, especially with things like models getting really good at breaches, at hacking. I think the market's always expanding. It's never going to shrink. In fact, one of the things when Mythos news came out, it was a double-edged sword. I think on one hand, some voices said, oh, this is the end of AppSec. The models are now going to take over. They know how to write code. They know how to hack code. So they'll be the best at telling you how to fix code. And so that was one suite of voices. The other suite of voices were basically saying, look, the model that wrote the code can't be the model that secures the code. It's trained a certain way, so you need a different model to be able to.
Yeah, I was going to actually on Mythos, right? We're talking about how I think it's a good thing is it put a lot of emphasis.
Yes, it does.
What is Mythos actually really good at when it comes to cybersec, and where is it overhyped? You mentioned a little bit of it, but maybe to double click on it.
Yeah, look, so we don't have access. Very few companies have access to Mythos, but you can go with what some of the companies that have done their testing, and they have compared Mythos, and some are very public case studies, Mythos or ChatGPT 5.5, who has cyber capabilities. I think it's undoubtedly, like at this point, it's a fact that Mythos and Mythos-like models are very good at, let's look at the source code, let's find a bunch of like small things that a human will find very difficult to actually chain together into an exploit and create a working exploit. I think this is a given at this point. This is a good innovation, it's a good technology, and it certainly will have its place. Now, writing software is complex. This class of things that Mythos and Mythos-like technologies can find and prove exploitability is a fraction of everything that has to go into producing secure software. Like everything we talked about, the developer supply chain, for example, that's not something Mythos is involved in. Now, I do think it's what I tell customers is like Mythos and Mythos-like models are part of the story, and they should be part of everybody's story. They really should. No vendor should be making a claim that, look, we built a better version of that, and you should use our niche. I think that's a difficult argument to make. But at the same time, Mythos is extremely expensive. So if I'll give you an example. Recently, one of our customers went from 15,000 pull requests a month to 30,000 in the last 3 months. So they doubled the amount of code they're producing, give or take, just because they switched to a different org structure with more agents writing code. The estimate for running Mythos on every single one of these is in the millions of dollars, like tens of millions, in fact, right? Because it costs money to run this model that runs for hours, consuming huge code bases. So it's kind of not something you want to be running every day on every line of code generated by an agent, at least not for the foreseeable future, right? So the question isn't, is Mythos great tech? Yes, of course it is. The question is, how do we best use it in addition to everything else
Yeah,
that
yeah, no, that makes sense. It's a very eloquent way. The first time I hear that framing, maybe to go back to Boost and like we talked about all the different opportunities because of just the market timing, right?
Yeah.
You guys are sitting at the right place at the right time. Going back to why I'm biased and bullish, what's for you the most exciting thing right now, right? For the prospects of Boost, now that you've closed your round, are you guys moving forward? What are you excited about?
I think a lot of things excite us. Really, I think so. So we touched upon Mythos. I think so one of the things that we're hearing a lot now is, for better or worse, I do think it's for better, the threat of AI models making exploitation very quick is forcing companies to rethink, all right, we got to up our game very quickly. And so there's this board level approval, if you will, to, all right, we got to get quote unquote Mythos ready, right? So we need to make sure that in a few months, when this technology is accessible to bad actors, that it's not point and click easy for them to get in. So there's this like big mandate. What does it take? So there's an area for innovation. There's an area we've been doing a lot. The developer endpoint stuff we're seeing a lot of traction. It's top concern. We're talking to CISOs. They're telling us like, everybody in my company's coding. I have no idea what they're downloading, what they're using, how they're doing it. I need to just understand what's there first and then start securing stuff. So that area also, I think, is very promising. The last area that we kind of are also, I think we were quite differentiated in, is the area of CI/CD security. We talked about supply chain attacks. It's mostly one model. You use open source packages. Some hacker poisons one. You use it. You get affected. You lose your credentials. Now they can impersonate you and do things like that. There's many other flavors of supply chain attacks. One of which is when companies think of their software that they build, they think of the main application, the main app that they built. That's what, but they don't realize is actually apps that you use to build those apps, those CI/CD pipelines. And they have their own technologies, and the common one would be GitHub workflows and GitHub Actions and things like that. But there's code there. It's instructions on how to take a developer input and test it. And if the tests pass, build this artifact. And if it works, push it to production and do things like that. And it turns out that these can be hacked too. So these are just software, and all software can be bypassed unless you put a lot of effort into it. And we're kind of considered experts in that area. In fact, not all, but a couple of the tools, the open source tools that I mentioned, are specialized for that area. And hackers are picking up, they're starting to abuse these types of attack surfaces. In fact, like I said, some of the biggest software companies in the world, they trust us to continuously help them find and fix and address these types of security issues. So there's no shortage. Like I said, the technology landscape is changing so fast and much faster than security research can keep up. And as a result, the industry is required to step up and find innovative answers to these problems.
I could go on for a while, man, with Boost, but maybe I want to, on one last topic, I want to geek out on with you is you mentioned Agile development, and it's like, it feels like Agile is no longer, that relevant.
Correct.
It's like I know you spoke with Fred a little bit about this whole brave new world of how you create software. So I want to selfishly pick your brain on how do you think about structuring your team, right? And now obviously with Boost, you have this blank slate of creating a new team. How should founders think about building software teams today?
Yeah, for sure. It's a great question, timely question. I've talked to many, not only founders, even large companies, even some huge airline companies are doing what I'm about to talk about, which is for the last, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years, best performing engineering teams were generally structured like a functional pyramid. You'd have an engineering head and then a number of directors or managers, and then you go down to like basically these two pizza teams. So 8 to 12 people, and they kind of own a project. They do these 2-week sprints, give or take. If you're really fancy, you're doing 1-week sprints. But it was at the Agile DevOps ship quick, ship fast. Of course, this was before agents did a lot of work. We didn't have coding agents. So the industry kind of woke up and said, okay, how do we write software in a day and age where agents should be able to write a lot of, what's the right team size? What's the right team structure? And so where I'm seeing a lot of convergence is those 8 to 12 person teams are too big. Okay, it was general consensus, because the assumption is like a good developer should be, who's good with AI and coding agents, should be able to drive, I don't know, 2 to 5 agents like continuously. You have some outliers that basically build systems of agents that prompt agents and work with it, but for the mass majority of, I think, the industry, it's really this one engineer has got 3 to 5 agents working at one point in time. And so a team of 3 to 4 engineers working closely on a particular project with good use of AI should be able to do the work of what used to be 10, 12 people before, right? So that's where they start with. Why 3, 4? Why not 8? Because communication overhead becomes a big thing. The dynamics change. It used to be that we needed 2-week sprints, maybe a bit, and then we'll do a day of planning to fill up work, because the bottleneck was we still need time to write the code. Now, you talk to many organizations that are restructured, they're like, we planned the sprint in a day and a half. The work is done in a day and a half. It makes no sense anymore to start doing the same old structure. So everything's being flipped upside down. I talked to high-performing organizations, considered some of the best engineers on the planet, right? And they're restructured into 3-person teams. There's no sprint. It's, here's our objectives for the quarter. These small pods are empowered and autonomous, and you work very closely with a product organization, product owner. There's no silos. There's no go up the communication chain and then down again. It's a lot about recognizing that the bottleneck is no longer writing code. It's about how fast you can learn, how fast you can respond to customer requests, market feedback, and so on and so forth. And it changes everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does the software team sit somewhere different? Do they need to be a silo anymore? Like,
I don't think they're a silo. I can tell you, I'm not going to mention the name, but like a large airline company that we work with, they have at this point, and this is like a 50-plus-year-old company, 600 developers in the last year. They used to have the traditional structure, and now it's 200 3-person teams. So completely autonomous, right? And they each own a small portion of the product, and they're expected to be autonomous and find information where they need to. It's not really, I think they still report to an engineering head just because of the size, but practically speaking, it's no longer centered around a functional center of excellence. Okay, we need to centralize engineering practices to make sure that we're doing things that are consistent across the board. There's always going to be an element of that, but it's more, let's organize for performance. What is the thing what is the organizational structure and body of knowledge and practice and culture that gives us maximum output? This is what everybody's organizing, because the assumption is that companies that figure that out sooner are just going to have such an advantage in ability to innovate that you have no choice. You have to get good at it quick or become so slow that you become irrelevant.
Yeah. It feels like the Red Queen effect, right?
Yes.
It's like totally the case
It's
today.
in play, yeah.
The faster you run, the faster you stay in place a little bit. But there's a few people that are able to break out, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Zaid, I think I could bug you for a lot more. Maybe a final question, like lessons learned from your first company that you're now porting over to Boost, right? Like any founder lessons and some of the scar tissue that you've brought?
Yeah, there's honestly too many to count. I think for the first one, I very much did textbook first-time founder scars. So if you build it, they will come. Tech is more important than figuring out go-to-market. Those were the two biggest ones. And we kind of, at Boost Security, we started off with, we're working with customers from day one. 6 months after I wrote the prototype myself, me and my co-founder, and 6 months prototype, it was already in production live at one customer. In the 3-4 months after, it was at 6 companies. Then we started the journey. So it was really work closely with clients from the beginning, trying to figure out go-to-market early on. I do think that it's, even though there's scar tissues, lessons learned, but the times are also different. So it's back then, cyber was still early. It was easier to stand out. Now there's just a lot of cyber companies in general. And there's a lot of companies that are really good at marketing, not so much at tech, but you have to compete with them. Again, the agents are kind of like the whole agentic technology is changing everything as well. So a lot of the lessons can be ported over, but I think what's more important is the skill, because you have to adapt. The conditions are not going to be the same, regardless of what lessons you can port over with you.
Yeah. Zaid, really appreciate your time
Oh,
today.
pleasure. Thank you for having me. It was
Final
great.
question would be
Yes.
just if people want to reach out, learn more about Boost and follow the journey or connect
Yeah.
with you.
Yeah, for sure. So boostsecurity.io is the company. If you're more interested on the security side, so like less commercial, more like interesting research, you can find everything on labs.boostsecurity.io. Me on LinkedIn, Zaid Al Hamami. Very easy to find me. Zaid, not many people with that name in cybersecurity with association to Boost Security.
Awesome. Thank you so much, man.
Thank you.